Well, we've mentioned Andrew Jackson several times. Now we are going to focus the spotlight on Jackson. Look a little bit of his background and follow his trajectory. He was born at a place called the Waxhaws, which is right on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, and at various times each of those states has claimed to be his birthplace or denied it, depending upon the prevailing attitude of the times. And frequently you will see it said that he was born in the Carolinas. So they were, of course, colonies, not states, at the time he was born. He served in the American Revolution as a kid, and at the age of 13 was taken prisoner along with his brother by the British, and was mistreated while he was in the custody of the British, as was actually not that unusual. One famous occasion had Jackson refusing to shine the boots, to polish the boots of a British general, and being apparently quite saucy about it. So the officer struck him across the face with his sword, which left a deep gash and a scar that Jackson carried from then on. And you might even assume that this, plus the suffering that he had, I think one of his brothers died, left him with a deep scar on the inside where the British were concerned. Now, eventually, he will have the nickname Old Hickory, and that nickname comes about because, well, hickory is a really, really hard wood, really tough, which people at the time believed was a good description for Andrew Jackson. By the way, spoiler alert, Andrew Jackson will eventually become president, and when he does, he is the 7th president of the United States. He is the last president to have been a Revolutionary War veteran. And that kind of came to that because so late, because he served so young. Well, he grew up poor in a Scots-Irish family. They're on what was then the western frontier of the Carolinas. He did, in fact, was in fact born in a log cabin. So another thing that makes him distinctive so far as presidents is that when he does become president, he will be the first person elected president not to have come from an elite, privileged, wealthy family. He really did start at the bottom. And after he grew up, after the war was over, he apprenticed with several lawyers. He was very promising, and eventually studied for the bar and passed the bar and became a lawyer. In 1788, he moved farther west in the frontier to the little frontier town of Nashville, and lived there for many years thereafter. In 1796, which was the year Tennessee became a state, he served on the state constitutional committee and was one of the people elected to the office of the House of Representatives from Tennessee. So the first group of congressmen to go to Washington from Tennessee. He was one of them. He only served one term, and then he served as a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court for 6 years. After that, he left politics, at least temporarily, and went back to the business of business, which included being a lawyer, but also included owning a plantation, the Hermitage, that he bought in 1804. Bought the property, built the house, and also became heavily involved in land speculation. Land speculation is, real estate is what that is. It's another word for real estate. Real estate development, right? You buy land on the gamble that it is going to be worth more either you buy it for less than it's worth, or you hope it's going to become worth more, and then you sell it for a higher price, right? So he did a lot of that. In fact, 1819, he and several of his friends who were fellow investors founded the city of Memphis, which is something that a lot of people don't know. They don't associate him with Memphis. So here he is out on the frontier serving as a lawyer, then moving his way up. Actually, he married into a very wealthy family, the Donaldson family, a prominent family there in Nashville, whom, when he first came to Nashville in 1788, he was a boarder at their house and met their daughter and fell in love with her and eventually married her, although that becomes a complicated story. He's a little bit rough-hewn, a little rough around the edges. Not the most peaceful guy, known for getting involved in several duels, the most famous one being this one with Charles Dickinson, in which the other guy, John Dickinson, the other guy, Dickinson, actually fired first. He got off the first shot and shot Andrew Jackson in the chest. So Jackson was still on his feet, so he took careful aim and killed the other guy, which was considered bad form, right? Once the first shot has been fired, it's kind of like considered kind of low down because the other person's helpless now. They don't have another bullet. But he didn't care. He was also involved in a kind of a wild gunfight with a couple of rivals of his on the staircase and around the perimeter of a Nashville hotel. The bullet that he took from Dickinson lodged so close to his heart that it was deemed too dangerous to take it out. So he just carried it with him for the rest of his life. Later, when he's involved in the military, from time to time he'd take a break, lean against a tree because his bullet was working closer to his heart, catch his breath, and go on. So Jackson was an extraordinarily colorful figure. He's kind of fun to talk about in some contexts, but he is also extremely complex, and many of the things about him really are not fun to talk about. Well, when the War of 1812 started, Jackson volunteered to lead a force of Tennessee volunteers for the U.S. Army, and he was, in fact, able to do that. And we've talked about his military ventures there in the Creek War, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and immediately afterward at the Battle of New Orleans, which no one involved in the battle knew that the war had been over for a couple of weeks. After that, he gets involved in some other stuff. So he comes back from Louisiana, and now he and his volunteers and the other U.S. military under his command are essentially they're in southern Georgia, and the federal government has concerns about the fact that the Spanish, who were in charge in Florida at that time, are sort of encouraging slaves to run away and come south to Florida, where they will be welcomed and not turned back over, usually welcomed by the Seminole Indians, who would frequently adopt these runaway slaves, or in some cases on raids. The Seminoles would raid into southern Georgia and capture slaves and then make them their slaves, but under the kinship slavery system, which was far different from plantation slavery. So anyway, General Jackson was given the order, do something to curb this problem of slaves running away to Florida. And so he decided the best way to do something about it was to invade Florida, which he did. Invaded Florida and basically surrounded the Spanish authorities at the Spanish headquarters and took away Florida from Spain. Now, there's one major problem with this, and that is that he did not have the authority to do that. He had been told, do something about the runaway slaves, and he got kind of creative in his response. Congress was furious about this. It was, for one thing, it was a big overstepping of his authority, they believed, and for another thing, they had just wrapped up a war with Great Britain. Now, there's the potential of going to war with Spain, and once more with Great Britain, because, while he was there in Spain, he captured a couple of British merchants that were suspected of supplying arms to the Seminoles, and so he hanged them just summarily on the spot, executed them, which is not considered good diplomacy. So Congress was furious. He was called before Congress, and he was censured by Congress. That means that essentially Congress took a vote saying, "You've been bad, stop it." It didn't carry any kind of a punishment, but it is an official mark on one's record. This, by the way, is what happened. This was done to President Bill Clinton almost 2 centuries later. Well, being censured by Congress and putting that mark on his record didn't really hurt him with his popularity with the average people in the country. In fact, it probably helped. He was already considered a great hero because of Horseshoe Bend and New Orleans, and now the Seminole War, which is what this was. He came in to fight the Seminoles and just kept going and fought the Spanish. So the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, had to meet with his equivalent from Spain, whose name was Onís, and negotiate a treaty, and Spain agreed to give Florida to the United States. And Jackson, who was being censured by Congress, like I said, there was no punishment involved, he was appointed the military governor of the new Florida Territory. So, in essence, Andrew Jackson was the first governor of Florida before it was a state. Well, he parlayed his popularity from all this to get back into politics, and in 1822 ran for the U.S. Senate to represent Tennessee, and was elected. All right, 1824, new presidential election cycle. James Monroe has finished out his second term, so he's going home. Who is going to be the next president? Who's going to represent the Democratic Republican Party, which is still the only party in existence? And initially, John Adams threw his hat in. He was the Secretary of State. Remember, the son of John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. John Quincy Adams wanted Andrew Jackson to be vice president because, as Adams said, vice president was the one job he could have where he couldn't hang anybody, and he couldn't really cause any major trouble. But Jackson didn't want to be vice president, and he decided he wanted to be president instead. So Jackson was running, William Crawford of Georgia was running, Henry Clay was running, and they were all running from the same party. Remember, there's only one party. Also, a fifth person was running, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who didn't get the amount of support that his supporters hoped he would. So he was convinced, he was persuaded to drop out of the race, and in return to accept the position of vice president, the vice presidential candidate from the Democratic Republican Party. Everyone agreed they'd rather have him be vice president. So therefore, when the election is held and all these people from the same party are running, they all know who's going to be the vice president, John C. Calhoun. Well, the election is held, and because it is somewhat divided, you've got Henry Clay of Kentucky, and you can see there he carries, he gets several electoral votes. You've got this guy Crawford, who carries his home state of Georgia, and also carries in Virginia and gets some votes in other places. And then Jackson is, as you can see, gets quite a few states. John Quincy Adams basically takes New York and all of New England. Jackson gets 41.4% of the vote. John Quincy Adams gets 30.9% of the vote. So no one gets a majority of the popular vote, and here's the problem: no one gets a majority of the electoral votes. I think they would have needed 132 at this point to get it. Andrew Jackson got the most. He got 99, and Adams came in second with 84, and the rest were fairly evenly divided between Crawford and Clay. Well, not enough. No one got enough votes to put them over the edge to win in the Electoral College. And when that happens, then it goes to Congress to vote and decide who's going to be the winner. And it was pretty sharply divided in Congress, but John Quincy Adams was able to persuade Henry Clay to withdraw from the race, because in Congress they're voting among all four of these guys. So Adams persuades Clay to drop out and persuades Clay to recommend to his own supporters they should support Adams. And that happens, and then Adams wins, and therefore gets the presidency. Andrew Jackson wasn't very pleased about this at all. And then, when it was announced that Henry Clay was going to be appointed the Secretary of State, he had previously been Speaker of the House, Jackson is more upset. He calls it a corrupt bargain, essentially saying that Clay had made a deal to throw his support in order for a plum position in the new administration. And, that's not illegal. That happens. And in fact, Jackson followed those practices as well himself. But now you've got John Quincy Adams, President of the United States, his Vice President, John C. Calhoun, and as Secretary of State, Henry Clay. During Adams' 4 years in office, he was a lot like his father, kind of outspoken, not the greatest public speaker, not the most charismatic person, very kind of garrulous in that he was strong about his own opinion, and he was kind of an intellectual. He really didn't like politics that much. He considered himself a little bit above the politicking that was involved. Some things about him, he favored the American system of Henry Clay, which, would make sense then that Clay would support him anyway. Favored a strong national government. Now, Adams had been a Federalist until just a few years before this, when Federalists ceased to exist. So a former Federalist, supporter of strong central national government. He tried harder to be fair to the Indians than the presidents who came immediately before and after him. Now, Monroe had pressured Indians in the South to take these deals that the government offered to give up their land in the South and accept new land west of the Mississippi. He didn't force them to do that, but he did find ways to sort of pressure them, and many of them, some of them took the deal. Adams didn't pursue that very strongly. He really didn't get that involved in anything with the Indians, and particularly in trying to remove them, which did not make him popular in the South because they wanted the Indians gone. Another thing that was interesting about Adams, remember his father had been a deist, and he himself was very much an intellectual and very much kind of a secular, temporal, pragmatic person that was devoted to the Constitution. So instead of putting his hand on the Bible when he was sworn in, he put his hand on a stack of law books. Well, Adams is not a real popular president. He loses support as his tenure goes on. Jackson decides to run against him again when he runs for re-election in 1828. And that's when this guy comes in, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was a senator from New York. He was from an old New York family. His family was in New York before it was New York. He was of Dutch descent. Back in the time when New York had been New Amsterdam, his family had come there. And in fact, Martin Van Buren didn't learn to speak English, didn't start learning to speak English until he was, I think, 5 years old. He spoke only Dutch when he was what today we would call preschool age. He becomes essentially Andrew Jackson's campaign advisor. No one had ever had a campaign advisor before because most people who ran for office acted like campaigning was beneath them because it made it seem like they wanted to serve for their own personal benefit. And even though most of them did, they would let someone else do the campaigning if campaigning was to be done and not get actively involved. Van Buren was highly organized, and in fact, he reorganized the party, that is the Democratic Republican Party, and got it sort of whipped into shape. It had fallen out of shape because it had been the only party and it hadn't really had any major challenges. So he whips it back into shape and simplifies its name to just plain Democratic Party, which it still is today. He believed that having a well-organized political party was important, and having more than one was important, because he thought he was fearful that the country was being divided between North and South, and he believed that political parties that bridged the divide of region might help save the country. So, I think I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. This party that was restructured by Van Buren was officially named the Democratic Party. It is not called the Democrat Party. It is the Democratic Party, and people who belong to it are Democrats. In recent years, more and more people who are not Democrats have taken to calling it Democrat Party instead of Democratic, because that's kind of a subtle way to imply it's not really democratic. And a lot of folks who hear that don't realize that's what's going on, and that's not the real name. And so you even hear some Democrats now referring to it as the Democrat Party. That's not what it is. All right, so all these things gave Van Buren the ability to be claimed by historians as the first modern politician. There's a bunch of politicians who historians apply that title to. All of them can't be first, right? But for different reasons they're called that. Him, because he was the first politician to organize a presidential campaign, kind of in the way that we're used to seeing them organized today. Well, this campaign between Jackson and the sitting president, John Quincy Adams, would become an extremely contentious contest, and it got really nasty. You want to think about nasty presidential campaigns. The campaign of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams was one. 1828 was another one. For example, things that were done. Adams' supporters started publicizing some circumstances of Andrew Jackson's marriage to Rachel Donaldson. Now, when he met her, she was already married, and the guy she was married to was very abusive and then abandoned her and was gone for, he was just gone, didn't come back. And Jackson later said that they received word that he had filed for divorce. And then some time passed. And then Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson did in fact get married. And then after they got married, her husband showed back up, and turned out that the divorce had never been finalized. So their marriage was not a legal marriage. And in fact, technically, Rachel was a bigamist, although both Jackson and his wife said that they thought she was divorced. Anyway, the divorce was then finalized, and then, about like 5 years after they had first gotten married, Jackson and then Mrs. Jackson got married again to make it legal. But now people are bringing that up and portraying Rachel as just kind of a tramp, as a bigamist, as kind of a loose woman. And the scandal was very difficult for her. She was sick at heart because of all this scandal. And over the course of the presidential campaign, she went from being sick at heart to being sick for real, and she died. And Jackson always blamed the presidential campaign and all those rumors and gossip as being what had really killed his beloved wife. So that's kind of nasty. But it wasn't confined to one side, because Jackson's supporters claimed that John Quincy Adams had a bunch of affairs. He was a serial philanderer, and that when he had been ambassador to Russia, he had procured young women, underage young women, for the Tsar of Russia to have sex with. He was the Tsar's pimp. Now, there's absolutely no evidence to any of that. But, sometimes accusations can stick, whether there's evidence or not. So, in essence, Jackson's supporters were calling John Quincy Adams, in modern terms, also they were calling him kind of a wimp. In fact, a campaign slogan for Andrew Jackson that his supporters used was, "Vote for the man that fights, not the man that writes." On the other hand, Adams supporters painted Andrew Jackson as basically kind of a psychopath, again to use a modern term. Now, both sides claimed that Thomas Jefferson loved their candidate and would have hated their opponent. Now, Thomas Jefferson had died 2 years earlier, in 1826. In fact, Thomas Jefferson and his old frenemy, John Adams, both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after they had signed the Declaration of Independence. Well, Adams supporters were like, Thomas Jefferson liked John Quincy Adams, and he would have hated Andrew Jackson, and Jackson supporters said the opposite. And Thomas Jefferson was dead, so, he couldn't really argue. Well, this time around, John C. Calhoun, who had served 4 years as vice president under John Quincy Adams, made it known to Andrew Jackson that he was not going to be on the ticket with Adams. He was going to support Jackson's candidacy because he had been very displeased with John Quincy Adams's policies regarding the economy, with the tariffs and with the efforts to strengthen the national government. Calhoun was a very strong states' rights person, so he switched sides, and he actually became the running mate of Andrew Jackson. So that meant John Quincy Adams had to get a new running mate, and he chose Richard Rush of Pennsylvania, who was the son of Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers. Now, the 1824 election had been pretty close, in part because the vote was divided among 4 people. This time around, not so much. As you can see, Jackson has a clear victory here. John Quincy Adams does do well in New England and in some of the coastal states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, although he loses New York. And so as a result, with Andrew Jackson getting a majority of electoral votes and 56.4% of the popular vote, he becomes president. John C. Calhoun remains vice president, and Jackson appoints Martin Van Buren as his Secretary of State. So, just like John Quincy Adams had received a lot of help to become president from Henry Clay and made him Secretary of State, which ticked off Andrew Jackson because he said that was immoral and corrupt, well, Martin Van Buren helped him get elected, so he made him Secretary of State. Now, one of the major questions that people would have about new presidents, starting with John Adams, president number 2, was, because this was a big debate of the time and remains one today, is this president for a strong national government, or does he favor states' rights? And in Andrew Jackson's case, the answer was yes. He was both, sometimes at the same time, depending on his mood and more often depending on who he was mad at that week. He was kind of mercurial in his temperament. He didn't really say a lot about his policies, and his policies kind of would change from moment to moment, even, again, depending on his mood and his temperament. Now, one of the big things about Andrew Jackson was he is considered to be the first populist president, that is to say, popular with the common people. And that's important because Andrew Jackson was the first person to run for president at a time when almost all of the states had changed their property requirements. So this was, the 1820s was the first time that white males who didn't have very much money or property were allowed to vote. And it becomes the first time a person gets elected president who was not born rich, who has made a deliberate effort not to kind of suppress the common people, but to side with them. And to further illustrate how he sided with the common people, Andrew Jackson made his inauguration open to the public, which had not been the case before. So the doors of the White House are open wide for anybody that can cram in there for the big party when Jackson gets inaugurated. And a bunch of farmers, a bunch of just average working people just come crowding into the White House. Some of the farmers are climbing in the windows. Some of the farmers brought their pigs with them. And the hoi polloi, the upper crust elites of Washington, were aghast at this type of behavior. Some other aspects of Jackson's presidency, what is called the spoils system began. And here's a cartoon of Jackson of a statue of Jackson riding a pig with money bags on it, saying, "To the victor belongs the spoils." That's an old saying. Whoever wins gets all the stuff. And so that's the approach he took. He came in and essentially fired everybody that had worked in the administration of the previous president and put his own people who were loyal to him in there. That hadn't been what was commonly done. It is now what is commonly done. In fact, it's just expected. It's part of the way things are done. But he's the one that started it. He also had his official cabinet. Now, the president's cabinet are the secretaries of stuff, right? The Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, today called the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury. He had his regular cabinet, but he also had informal advisors that were friends of his and business associates of his that he really relied on their judgment more than that of the various secretaries of this and that. So they began to be referred to sarcastically as the kitchen cabinet. This period saw the rise of political machines, by which I don't mean voting machines. I'm talking about, and Martin Van Buren was essentially behind this, the idea that once an election is over, the party apparatus keeps going, and it keeps turning, and it keeps working, immediately starting to prepare for the next election. And so it's a full-time operation, the political party is. Newspapers have a growing role in politics during Jackson's time, some of them supporting Jackson and many of them not. Well, the first really, really big challenge, well, I shouldn't say the first really big challenge, one of the first really big challenges that Jackson is going to have is going to involve some opposition between him and his own vice president.